All right, let's get right into it. We all have this sort of autopilot, right? A bunch of routines and reactions that just run in the background. It's how our brain tries to be efficient. But what happens when that autopilot starts steering you somewhere you really don't want to go? Well, today, we're going to look at the new science that explains how our brains actually form habits, why we sometimes feel totally helpless, and, this is the important part, how we can learn to take the wheel back. I mean, come on, this is a question we've all asked ourselves probably a million times. Whether it's that mindless scrolling on your phone, or grabbing junk food when you're not even hungry, or putting off that big project. Again, we find ourselves doing things we know aren't good for us, but it feels like we're just powerless to stop. So what is going on there? And let's just push that idea a little further. What if, when things get really tough or stressful for a long time, our brain's natural built-in reaction isn't to fight back, but to just become passive? What if helplessness isn't something we learn at all, but it's actually our factory default setting? Now, that's a pretty wild idea, and it basically turns a 50-year-old psychological theory completely upside down. To get this, we actually have to go way back to 1890, the psychologist William James. He really understood something deep about the brain. It is an efficiency machine. It loves creating these automatic routines, habits, to handle all the predictable stuff in life. And this quote, it just perfectly explains why that's a good thing. It frees up our conscious mind to deal with new, tricky problems. So this autopilot is a feature, not a bug. But sometimes that feature really needs a manual override. So let's start with that manual. If we're going to override the autopilot, we first have to understand how it's programmed in the first place. This is the hands-on science of how you can actually intentionally build new routines from scratch. So what health psychologists tell us is that forming a new habit isn't some kind of magic trick. It's more like a recipe with 4 key ingredients. You start with a goal, what you want to do. But a goal by itself is not enough. You need a stable cue, that's the trigger for the action. Then comes the really important part, repetition. Just doing the thing over and over again when you get that cue. And finally, reinforcement, which is the reward that strengthens that whole loop. Okay, now what's really cool here is just how powerful the right cue can be. You could set a time-based cue, like, okay, I'll go for a walk at 10 a.m., but that means you gotta keep watching the clock. A way more powerful method is an event-based cue, something like, I'll go for a walk right after I finish my morning coffee. Why does that work so much better? Because you're literally piggybacking the new habit onto a habit you already have, which makes the new thing feel way more automatic, way faster. So how long does all this take? Well, you can just forget that old myth that it takes 21 days to form a habit. The research shows the real range is huge. It can take anywhere from 18 days all the way up to 254 days for a new behavior to feel automatic. So the big takeaway here is this. It's not about hitting some magic number of weeks. It's all about consistent repetition, no matter how long it actually takes for you. Okay, so we have the manual for building good habits. But what about that other idea we started with, that feeling of being completely stuck? For half a century, psychology was really dominated by one very powerful theory that tried to explain why we give up. And it all started with this famous experiment. So researchers had 3 groups of animals. Group 1 could do something to stop a mild electric shock. Group 3, they got no shock at all, but the key here was Group 2. They got the exact same shocks as Group 1, but there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop them. Their situation was totally uncontrollable. Later, when all 3 groups were put in a new box where they could escape, only Group 2 didn't even try. They just sat there. The conclusion just seemed so obvious, and it became the theory of learned helplessness. The animals in Group 2 had supposedly learned from that first experience that their actions didn't matter, right? That the outcome had nothing to do with what they did. So in the new situation, they didn't even bother trying. They had learned to be helpless. And this single idea has shaped how we think about things like depression and trauma for decades. But what if that simple, really intuitive story got the whole thing completely backward? Because what new science is showing us is that after 50 years, we might have been looking at this all wrong. That's right. By actually looking at the brain circuits involved, scientists found that the original theory had the cause and effect totally reversed. We don't learn to be helpless. It's actually much, much more profound than that. And this just lays out the massive shift perfectly. The old theory said we learn to be passive. The new science says, nope, passivity is the brain's default, unlearned response to stress you can't control. The old theory said helplessness is a learned behavior.
The new science says that control is the thing we have to learn. The active process isn't learning to give up, it's learning how to take charge.
So, how does this actually work in the brain? Well, think of it like this. Your brain has a passivity switch, and when you're facing a lot of stress that you just can't get away from, this switch automatically flicks on. It makes you feel passive, anxious. But, and this is the good news, you also have a control center that can reach over and turn that switch off. The catch is, your control center isn't automatic. It actually has to learn how to do that job. Taking control is a skill your brain literally has to build. So, this isn't just a story about a passivity switch. It's really about how we can build a resilient circuit. It's about the brain actively learning how to master its own default settings. And here's basically how it works. That control center we talked about sends a shut it down signal to what you can think of as the panic button. So when an animal successfully escapes something stressful, its control center lights up and shuts down that default passive response. It is actively learning, in real time, that its actions have an effect. And what's so fascinating is that learning control is actually a two-step process in the brain. First, one part of the circuit detects that your actions are making a difference. It's the part that goes, hey, what I'm doing is working. Then, a second, separate part acts on that news, sending out the all-clear signal to shut down the stress response. It's this beautiful, coordinated dance of detection and then action. And this leads to this incredible thing called immunization. When your brain successfully takes control over a stressful situation, it doesn't just solve that one problem. The experience actually strengthens that control pathway. It literally rewires the circuit, making it stronger and more efficient. And this acts like a kind of vaccine, protecting you from the passive effects of future stressors, even the ones you can't control. So let's bring these two big ideas together. On one hand, we have the science of intentionally building habits. And on the other, we have this new science of our brain's default passive response. So how do they connect? Well, here's the crucial point. If passivity is our default setting and control is a learned skill, then the process of building good habits is our main tool for teaching our brain that skill. Every single time you successfully follow through on an intention, using a cue, repetition, and getting a reward, you are actively training your brain's control center. You're giving it solid evidence that your actions matter, and you're strengthening the very circuit that overrides helplessness. And that really leaves us with a final, and I think, pretty empowering thought. Building good habits isn't just about being more productive or about self-improvement anymore. It's a fundamental way we teach our brains how to be resilient. It's how we go from our biological default to an intentional design for our lives. So the question for you isn't just what you want to achieve, but what skills do you want to teach your brain? If control is a learned skill, what habits will you build to master your default settings?